The film industry is widely seen as a male-dominated field. Ask anyone to name their favourite directors or screenwriters, and names like Alfred Hitchcock, Steven Spielberg, or Quentin Tarantino are likely to come up. This dominance feels so normal, as though it's always been the natural order of things. But this isn't true. At the birth of cinema, women were not only present, they were pioneers. During the silent film era, women played foundational roles in shaping what would become the language of cinema. Figures like Guy-Blaché, Frances Marion, and Anita Loos wrote, directed, and produced. Their relative invisibility today raises a pressing question: why have these women been forgotten? This video aims to explore how the erasure of women from early cinema history reflects a larger pattern in the film industry that can be seen even today, one in which women are welcomed only when the stakes are low and pushed aside when money, prestige, or power are on the line. When film was first invented in 1895, it was experimental and widely dismissed as a passing novelty. Ironically, it was this lack of prestige that created a rare window of opportunity for women as, with few people taking movie making seriously as a business, the doors were wide open. At a time when most professions excluded women, cinema offered a surprising kind of accessibility. Screenwriting wasn't what it is today. The role didn't even really exist. Films initially began more as skits, simple scenes with self-contained stories that didn't require movement from the camera. So the role of what we would consider a screenwriter was more about creating a concept. Prior to 1912, films were made by writers submitting story ideas to magazines. This meant a lot of women ended up submitting story ideas. These women, primarily white and middle class, found in screenwriting a form of expression that didn't require public visibility. However, the very informality that granted them access also contributed to their erasure. The open submission system meant that by the time the film was developed and released, the source of the original idea had been lost. This often meant that the original writers were forgotten. But there was a point in time where women were so tied to filmmaking that one of the reasons this stuff wasn't tracked properly was because it was so obvious. There was no reason to assume that anything was going to change. Nevertheless, from copyright records, we know that almost half of all films made before 1924 were written by women, a staggering figure that rarely appears in popular histories of cinema. It's important to keep in mind that the welcoming of these women was also strategic. It's not just that cinema wasn't being taken seriously, but many saw it as seedy and indecent. Making it something that wholesome housewives and young women could take part in helped with its brand image. France were the leading pioneers into the film age. Who created the first film camera exactly is a little fuzzy timeline-wise, but it's between Edison and the Lumiere brothers around 1895. With the invention of the film camera came investors who wanted to sell the product. Léon Gaumont decided to start manufacturing projection equipment and eventually went on to found Gaumont Company, a film production company that still exists to this day. On the official website, there's a history section that mentions it was Alice Guy, his secretary, who quickly suggested, from the late 1890s, enhancing the presentations of equipment sold by the company with filmed sketches. The language used here is very interesting. It is the briefest of mentions, and you would have no reason to even guess that his secretary went on to found her own production company and sustain a 2-decade-long career in cinema. What the official website fails to mention is, in 1896, Alice Guy-Blaché wrote, directed, produced, and starred in The Cabbage Fairy, one of the first narrative films ever made. She saw the medium's potential for storytelling long before others did, as the camera's first use was initially for more documentary purposes. Yes, her official job title was as Gaumont's secretary, but with this, she carried many responsibilities and was integral to the development of the company. She created a body of films that outpaced Edison, Lumiere, and Méliès. She was heavily involved in the creation of what was considered the Gaumont house style, and to only get a sentence dedicated to her on the official page is crazy. As film developed into more narrative structures, dialogue was introduced through the use of intertitles, title cards. Anita Loos is an example of someone who started her career submitting stories from home. She was only a teenager when D.W. Griffiths brought her on board to write for the studio. She wrote over 150 scripts as a Hollywood screenwriter. She also wrote the novel Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, but that's just a fun fact. Women were not only innovating technically, they were expanding the thematic scope of film. Screenwriters like Julia Crawford-Eifers Janine McPherson and Frances Marion tackled complex, often controversial issues. Films such as The Honor of His House, which dealt with alcoholism, and The Godless Girl, which explored juvenile delinquency, illustrate how these writers moved well beyond the domestic or sentimental stories they were initially expected to write.
Although Frances Marion's career was soaring, the climate for most women working in Hollywood was dramatically changing. Movies had become big business, and the stakes were higher.
Nobody thought that movies were going to be much of anything. I mean, it was a kind of a little silly thing that was going to maybe go away. And so they invited women to write and to do the various things, and women did. And then when the movies began to be important and really become a major industry, then the men said, hey, I mean, what's this? We want in. And so women kind of moved out as the men moved in.
This video has been focusing on Hollywood, and as mentioned, the women being discussed were predominantly middle class and white. It's important to note that women of colour were also involved in the silent film era, they just weren't working in Hollywood. Filmmakers such as Tracy Souders, Alois King Patrick Geist, and Zora Neale Hurston. Verdict Not Guilty, for example, is a film that tells the story of a woman pleading for entrance to heaven. Meanwhile, Zora Neale Hurston, anthropologist, folklorist, and documentary filmmaker, used to chronicle the daily life of Southern black culture with logging, children's games, and baptism. Little research has been done on black female filmmakers of this time, so the information on them is even more limited than that of their white counterparts. Shout out to the Women Film Pioneers Project and the article African American Women in the Silent Industry, where I got this information, because as stated, you have to really go digging to find this stuff. When looking at the modern film industry today, it's clear that progress has been made towards re-including women, but the underlying reluctance to trust them with major financial stakes remains. You just have to pay attention to when and how women are allowed in. The biggest example that comes to mind can be found in the Twilight film franchise. The first film, directed by Catherine Hardwicke, was made on a $37 million budget, which is not considered a large amount, and carried the aesthetics and creative freedom of an indie film. Studio executives believed that the film would have little commercial success, likely due to its origins, a book series written by a woman with a largely female fanbase. Contrary to these low expectations, Twilight grossed over $400 million worldwide and became a cultural phenomenon. Yet, instead of being celebrated and retained for the sequels, Hardwicke was replaced. Every subsequent Twilight installment was directed by a man. Though the films remained commercially successful, many fans and critics observed a shift in tone, one that lacked the visual intimacy and emotional nuance of Hardwicke's version. As the franchise grew more polished and more commercially driven, it also became more male-controlled. Hardwicke herself commented on the creative freedom she had due to the low expectations surrounding the project. I didn't have committees giving me notes, I wasn't being watched by big-time producers, I didn't have the pressure of hitting blockbuster marks. This recalls the same conditions that allowed women to flourish during the silent era. Twilight exemplifies a broader trend in which women are systematically sidelined once creative opportunities become tied to significant financial investment. In 2024, women directed only 16% of the top 250 grossing films and just 11% of the top 100, down from the previous year. The consistent success of women-led films has not translated into long-term opportunities. Twilight is a pretty popular example of this type of thing, but there are, unfortunately, plenty more. Teresa Rebeck, creator and showrunner of Smash, stepped down after just one season of the show, but went on to explain in an interview that she was in fact fired. Smash was her creation, a show based on her personal life. She stated that, "I was explicitly told during my firing that the show was too important to the network, and so they were taking it out of my hands. The person they gave it to had virtually no credentials and no experience in the theatre. His television credits were nowhere near as comprehensive as mine. The show died under his watch." Brenda Chapman was the first woman to direct a Pixar film, Brave, but partway through production she was replaced. This was a story that I created, which came from a very personal place as a woman and a mother. To have it taken away and given to someone else, and a man at that, was truly distressing on so many levels. Similarly, Kelly Marcel adapted 50 Shades of Grey, which grossed over $570 million, but was pushed aside for its follow-ups. Being a screenwriter is known to not be the most secure job. They can easily be removed from projects regardless of gender, but these examples go beyond that. These are not isolated incidents. They speak to a persistent industry discomfort with placing long creative and financial control in the hands of women. Another reason this pattern of exclusion has endured is that women have often been encouraged, if not conditioned, to downplay their own achievements. In both academic and professional settings, studies have shown that women are less likely than men to present themselves as experts, even when equally or more qualified. This reluctance stems from internalized cultural expectations, fear of social backlash, and a long history of being undervalued in public-facing professions. Guy-Blaché, one of the medium's pioneers, dismissed her own trailblazing work as just little stories I would make up. Her modesty may have been sincere, but it also reflects a broader pattern in which these women took their work seriously, but not themselves. This dynamic helps contribute to the erasure of their legacy. I feel like this video has been a little doom and gloom, but there are positives to the points I'm making, I promise. Despite these ingrained challenges, there are signs of progress. Women today are more aware of the importance of recognition, and many are actively working to ensure that credit is not just given, but properly tracked. The film industry's journey into inclusion is in no way linear, but in many ways, history is looping back to its beginnings. Just as the early film industry was accessible because it wasn't yet taken seriously, platforms like YouTube and TikTok are allowing emerging screenwriters and filmmakers to experiment, create, and share their work without institutional gatekeeping. This video was a bit more academic in style because I initially wrote it for my module, A History of Screenwriting. As an aspiring screenwriter/filmmaker, I was so excited to hear that the film industry has not always been as male-dominated as it seems. If you want to look deeper into any of the things I mentioned, there's a bibliography in the description with all of my sources. I did a lot of research. I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you so much for watching.